Professor Jack Hamilton, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm so happy you're here. So Professor Hamilton is a professor in American Studies at the University of Virginia. You're a professional musician, a gorgeous writer, and cultural critic with Slate, and quite the basketball fan, I gather.
Yeah, it's tough times to be an NBA fan.
Well, I'm so happy you're here to learn with us today. So could you set the stage for us? Who is Jimi Hendrix, and what was going on during the Vietnam War?
So Jimi Hendrix was a guitar player. He died quite young in 1970 at the age of 27, but he was an incredibly influential and just important American musician, like really probably someone, I think most people consider him maybe the greatest electric guitar player ever. Certainly someone who kind of transformed the possibilities of the electric guitar as an instrument, incredibly influential force on the development of rock and roll music and popular music generally. Really interesting guy. He was actually from Seattle, Washington, he had actually, before becoming a professional musician, had actually served in the military, which is somewhat unusual for musicians of his generation. And Jimi Hendrix really came into prominence, became a huge star in 1967, which was really kind of as the Vietnam War was hitting kind of a real sort of fever point for the United States. And the Vietnam War, for people who aren't familiar with it, was a really kind of important and complicated conflict that America found itself in the 1960s. It was a war first of all, it's the first war that the United States ever lost. They did not end up really officially losing the war until the mid-1970s, but it was a war that really transformed a lot of Americans' kind of relationship to ideas about their government and their military. It was a war that the United States found itself in basically because of a really sort of bizarre series of kind of alliances with France. France had been in sort of colonial control of Vietnam for a very long time. The United States gets sort of pulled into this conflict, trying to sort of assist France. And then France kind of ultimately ends up kind of absenting itself from this, and the United States is sort of still there, and they're fighting against basically an insurgency of people who are sort of fighting for freedom. So it was a war that was both, it was a war that a lot of Americans didn't really understand why we were involved in it. It was a war that really sort of complicated the way that the United States had traditionally seen itself as being the sort of quote-unquote good guys. I think Americans prior to this had liked to think of themselves as being on the side of liberation, certainly kind of after the Second World War. The Second World War had been this war that was, where we were very clearly seeming to fight against kind of evil and the Nazis and fascism and things like that. And in Vietnam, it really started to feel like, for a lot of people, the more they learned about the conflict, the more it was like, maybe this is, maybe we're not on the right side of this thing. And, this is something, and that itself was like a really important realization for a lot of people to have. And certainly it was a huge turning point, again, in a lot of Americans' relationship to the government and to the military, and particularly for young people. This was one of the big things with the Vietnam War. There was a draft so you had sort of, you had mandatory military service if you were selected in the draft, which was sort of supposedly a random draft. So you had also this sort of generation of young people, people who are sort of college age and things like that, who are being sent off to fight in this horrible conflict and die in it for a cause that, again, like very few people really had, very few people found it very easy to kind of believe in this.
I think there's some really interesting parallels, too, for students right now, because the Vietnam War was this moment where millions of people were terrified that they might be called up to serve and their life would be displaced and they would be separated from their friends, their education. Of course, there were educational loopholes, but I do think that there's sort of a resonance that we're going through in a very different context with that moment and that uncertainty that you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things, like, the concept of the draft, and we haven't had a draft in the United States since Vietnam, largely because the sort of opposition to the draft in the Vietnam era became so intense among Americans. But yeah, that sort of that sense of that you could be, like, there really, you were, military service was something that, you could kind of be randomly selected to do. And there's certainly been drafts previously in American history. But again, there was something about the nature of this conflict that was so confusing and sort of, just really kind of unappealing to a lot of people. The sense of, like, why are we doing this? And that was like, and the anti-war movement in Vietnam, I would say, is probably more pronounced and more kind of effective and more widespread than probably any war previously in American history. Just a massive sort of grassroots movement of people protesting against the war, protesting against the draft. People would, famously kind of burn their draft notices, the letters that they had been sent that telling them to, show up at X, military station, base or whatever, burning their draft cards, which was, contained a number that they were assigned that would be, pulled out of the random lottery and things like that.
Okay, so let's talk about two songs that you pulled for us. And you said some really interesting things. So first of all, you said that Jimi Hendrix grows up in Seattle, so he's a product of the Great Migration. He grows up in the West and the North in an urban context, which is quite different, and he's a veteran. So the first song I think you wanted to talk about is All Along the Watchtower, which came out in 1968. Tell us about this song. What is the background, and what should we be listening for?
Yeah, so this is actually a song. It's kind of an interesting. This is one of probably Jimi Hendrix's most famous recordings, and it's actually a cover, meaning it's a song that was written by someone else. Hendrix wrote a lot of his own material. He did not write this song. This is a song that was written by Bob Dylan, the very, very, very famous singer songwriter, and Jimi.
Who is that Bob Dylan fellow?
Bob Dylan fan. Sorry, what's that?
I said, who is this Bob Dylan fellow?
Yeah. And Jimi Hendrix was a huge Bob Dylan fan. He recorded a lot of different Bob Dylan compositions over the course of his career, and certainly was also very actually influenced by him as a singer. I mean, you can tell in Jimi Hendrix's singing style, you can really hear the influence of Bob Dylan. But yeah, and this was a composition of Bob Dylan's that was actually written just a year before Hendrix recorded it, so it was actually a relatively new song at this point. And the song, it has these sort of, it's a very sort of, in Dylan's version, it's a very kind of ominous, sort of quiet, understated song that has this really incredible imagery of basically being kind of like in a situation that you kind of can't get out of. Like there's a sort of ominous quality, like there's this sort of impending danger, sort of something bad is on the verge of happening. And Jimi Hendrix, clearly hears something in the song that it's sort of different than the Dylan version, and drastically rearranges it and turns it into a more kind of up-tempo, real sort of rock song, with a lot of with much sort of louder and more elaborate instrumentation, and it really becomes like one of the most kind of iconic pieces of Vietnam War era music. This is a song that you'll often hear if you watch movies about the Vietnam War. It's sort of become almost like an audio signifier for the Vietnam War. And part of it, again, is because Hendrix is able to take the sort of song themes of danger, of kind of this, encroaching violence, sort of doom that's impending, and really turn them into something that feels very kind of explicitly about the Vietnam War. Like the first line of the song is there must be some kind of way out of here, I believe is the first line of the song, which is like itself just feels like that is what people were looking for, in Vietnam, was like sort of a way, what's the way out, and this sort of sense that there was no
we got to get out of this place.
Like, yeah, exactly. That's another very famous Vietnam War song. So that sort of that sense of sort of dread. But also, it's just a gorgeous piece of music. I mean, particularly Hendrix's guitar playing. He also plays bass on this recording, which is somewhat unusual. So he's playing a number of different instruments. And there's all different guitar tracks. There's an acoustic guitar that he's playing. There's a number of different electric guitars. The song kind of opens with this really sort of very kind of startling and kind of arresting guitar part that sort of explodes in the opening itself, like this sort of burst of guitar in this sort of syncopated rhythmic pattern.
That's amazing. Thank you. So I'm definitely going to include the song so we can listen to it a few times and think about it. And then let's talk about the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock, at the music festival. So this happens August 1969. Why was this an iconic festival in American culture, and what should we be paying attention to in Hendrix's performance?
Yeah, so Hendrix's performance of the Star-Spangled Banner, which he actually played in the very early morning on the last day of the festival. It's one of the most famous, probably one of the most famous musical performances, period, in American history. It achieved this kind of legendary status, partly because of the fact that, Woodstock itself was a music festival in August of 1969, as you mentioned, that drew hundreds of thousands of people, somewhat unexpectedly. It was planned as a just sort of music and art festival in a sort of rural New York state. And it ended up just sort of snowballing into this massive event that drew people. People came from all over the country to attend this thing. Just like I think there were 30 or 40 musical acts that performed over the course of 3 days. And Hendrix was actually one of the last performers at Woodstock. He was one of the last acts on the bill. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't know about this performance, is that it happened on a Monday morning. So most people had left.
Wow.
By the time Hendrix was performing. Like, it's one of these things that, like, it's the most famous performance of Woodstock, and but most of the people who attended Woodstock probably would not have been there to hear it. They had to go back, go home. And so Hendrix he opens his set with playing the Star-Spangled Banner, which he had actually played quite a few times live. It was sort of a staple of his set in this period. He would play this at other concerts too. It's just the Woodstock one is by far the most famous. And it had like a lot of different kind of resonances. He always claimed that he just liked the song. Like he said, he always everyone thought that it was like sort of everyone kind of assumed that it was a sort of explicit political statement, like he was making a commentary on, the nature of the United States, or, the role of its government, particularly in this Vietnam War era. Hendrix himself always kind of like, he was a little evasive when people would ask him about that, and he would often say things like, "I just like the song."
Nice.
It obviously did have all of those meanings, so and he was certainly aware of that. I think he just like kind of preferred to let the music speak for itself. But yeah, he does this solo electric guitar performance in the early morning hours, and this was actually interestingly too. If you watched, at least when I was a kid, you may remember this too, if you watched television in the really early morning, like 5 a.m. when like TV programming would kind of come back on, they would often start by playing the Star-Spangled Banner.
Well, in my case, really late at night, yes.
Yeah. And that was something that Hendrix was, I think, explicitly also referencing, like this sort of weird, kind of kitschy cultural practice of like television, as a sort of way that this is, the Star-Spangled Banner, it's like a song that everyone knows, and it's sung kind of like reflexively at like sporting events and things like that. It's so familiar
the kickoff,
to so many people. Yeah, and but so he performs this rendition of it on electric guitar that's just completely kind of incendiary. It's like got this like it's beautiful. Like he just like does incredible things with the melody, sort of elongating phrases and kind of doing various types of improvisation. Lots of sort of feedback and distortion at various points, which was certainly one of his kind of trademark. One of the reasons Hendrix was so influential was his use of things like distortion and feedback on his electric guitar and sort of repurposing that stuff to sort of in a sort of more musical context. And then he also sort of starts to kind of at points straying away from the song completely, and at one moment that's very famous, he starts playing, towards the end of the song, he actually starts playing taps, which is the traditional military melody that's played at funerals. So really, really like this kind of like really tying together a lot of the sort of feelings that are happening in the United States in the late 1960s, and particularly around the Vietnam War. This sort of like a kind of conflicted sense of patriotism, this association of patriotism with death and destruction. Like there's a lot of, the sounds that he's able to make with his guitar sort of mimic often kind of the sounds of explosions and the sounds of bombs dropping and things like that. Again, all of which is like extremely deliberate on his part. And yeah, it is able to produce this just incredible statement. It's like it's a song, it's a performance. Shortly after it, a columnist for the New York Post, like writing up the Woodstock Festival, referred to it, I believe, as the high watermark of the 1960s.
Wow.
It's like basically saying this is like, this performance was the greatest thing that had happened in the 1960s. A number of other writers have sort of, called it one of the greatest pieces of protest music ever heard in the United States. But it's interesting because Hendrix himself, again, actually didn't, when he was asked about it as quote-unquote protest music, sort of demurred on that. Like he was, he didn't want it to be simply categorized kind of as that. And it's interesting too, and it again traces back to the fact that he was a veteran. He was someone who had actually served in the military. He did not fight in Vietnam, but he was in the military sort of before Vietnam had really, really ramped up in terms of a conflict that the United States was involved with. But he had that past, of service and things like that, which is something that I think, would have deeply affected him and his relationship to America. Also, I mean, obviously, we're saying that Hendrix was a black man in the United States who had certainly, even though he did not grow up in the South, had certainly encountered a lot of racism and had a lot of, certainly had a very, very sort of fraught relationship to sort of ideas of justice in America, being a black man in the United States, and sort of seeing, coming face to face with sort of racial injustice and racism and things like that, and certainly that itself also infusing, the Vietnam War. This was something. I mean, one of the things that people often talk about with Vietnam was that it was a war. It was disproportionately fought by poor people. This is something that if you had money, if you had means, if you had sort of access to privilege and things like that, there were ways that you could get out of serving in Vietnam, which is certainly that's true of many wars, but it was something that was particularly kind of acute in Vietnam, was the sense that who was fighting and dying in this war were people who were already sort of disadvantaged, and people who are already living in a sort of state of inequality, and this was kind of exacerbating that.
Thank you so much. This is so helpful. And I think that The fact that Hendrix refused
rambling.
No, you're fine. I think the fact that Hendrix refused to state what it's about gives us an opportunity to really listen to the music and interpret it for ourselves.